So if you look at the raw data for, like, Fortune 500 CEOs or political incumbents, straight white men are sitting pretty comfortably at the head of the table.
Right, they absolutely are. They hold the gavels, they hold the board seats, and mathematically speaking, they hold the vast majority of institutional power.
Exactly. So that brings up this massive question. Why do sociological metrics show that this exact same demographic is experiencing this unprecedented crisis of displacement?
It is a wild contradiction, isn't it?
It really is. And that's what we're getting into today. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Today we're unpacking this fascinating stack of excerpts from a piece titled The Waning Hegemony of the Conservative White Male.
It's quite a title.
Yeah, it doesn't hold back. But our underlying mission for you today is to, look past the political noise. We want to examine the strict sociological, economic, and demographic data that's driving what might be the most intense cultural friction of our time.
And honestly, the sheer friction between those two realities is what makes this analysis so compelling. I mean, on one hand, you have this statistical overrepresentation in absolute power.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have a rapidly accelerating sense of institutional and social loss. And the source material suggests that to actually understand this paradox, we have to examine three intersecting layers of American life.
Okay, so what are the three layers?
So we've got the shifting demographic math, the changing economic realities, and then the battle over institutional policies.
Got it.
When you layer the data from those three sectors on top of each other, well, the illusion of a straight line between holding power and feeling powerful completely shatters.
Let's start with that first layer, then the demographic math. Because there is a statistic in these notes that genuinely stopped me in my tracks.
Oh, I think I know which one you're talking about.
You probably do. Because we hear about shifting populations all the time, right? But the Census Bureau data, provided at our source, shows that the non-Hispanic, quote-unquote, white alone population in the United States isn't just declining as a relative percentage.
No, it's an absolute decline.
Yes, it is dropping in absolute numbers. We are talking about a drop from 223.6 million down to roughly 204.3 million.
That is nearly a 20 million person disappearance from that specific census category.
Which is wild. Like, how does a population just shrink by 20 million people?
Well, that absolute decline is a foundational shock to the system. Currently, that demographic makes up about 56.3% of the country, but demographic projections point to a majority-minority nation by 2045.
By 2045. So that's just around the corner.
Exactly. Now, obviously, part of this is driven by rapid growth among Latino, Asian, and multiracial populations, through birth rates and immigration.
Right, the growing pie.
But a 20 million person absolute drop in just a few decades. That requires something more than just birth and death rates. It actually points to a fundamental shift in how Americans are choosing to identify themselves.
That is exactly what I was trying to figure out. Because, 20 million people don't just vanish into thin air. There has to be something happening with how people are actually categorizing themselves on these official forms.
Yeah, it feels like the definition of identity itself is becoming much more fluid, and the sociological data entirely supports that hypothesis.
So what are people doing differently on the census?
Well, an increasing number of Americans are identifying as multiracial, or they're claiming a Hispanic ethnicity. Sociologically, this moves individuals out of that strict single-race white category.
Oh, I see.
So what we are witnessing is an evolution of cultural norms. I mean, decades ago, social advantages heavily incentivize identifying as solely white if a person could.
Right. There is a systemic benefit to checking that specific box.
Exactly. But today, as stigmas reduce and cultural pride and diverse heritage grows, the way people categorize their own identity on a census form evolves.
So the demographic foundation of the country is quite literally shifting beneath the surface.
Yeah, and it's driven just as much by changing social psychology as it is by birth rates.
That is fascinating. But, when the cultural architecture around you is changing that rapidly, people usually rely on economic stability to sort of anchor them.
Absolutely.
But the sources highlight that for a massive subset of this demographic, specifically working-class white men, that economic anchor has completely vanished.
It has. The demographic reality is crashing headfirst into a very harsh economic reality.
So walk me through the economics here.
Well, the macroeconomic shifts over the last 40 years have just devastated the specific industries that formed the bedrock of middle-class identity for these men. The text details how subsets of working-class white men are dealing with incredibly stagnant wages and a really severe decline in traditional manufacturing sectors.
So we are looking at the evaporation of jobs that historically provided Not just a paycheck, but like a distinct societal role.
Exactly, a sense of purpose, of being the undisputed provider.
And reading through the data on how they are struggling to adapt to the new knowledge economy, this image kept coming to my mind.
Oh, yeah. What kind of image?
It's kind of like running up a down escalator.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, like you're exhausting yourself, right? Putting in all this physical effort just to maintain your current position against the downward pull of stagnant wages and lost manufacturing jobs.
Right, you have to run just to stay in place.
Exactly. But worse, it's like you look up and realize the floor you're trying to reach doesn't even exist anymore. The cultural architecture of the building itself has completely transformed around you.
That perfectly captures the dual nature of the displacement. I mean, the mechanical resistance of the escalator represents the economic forces, sure.
Yeah.
But that vanishing floor you mentioned, that is the educational gap. Yeah, the data shows working-class white men are experiencing significantly lower rates of higher education compared to their female peers.
So they're getting hit from both sides.
Exactly. They are losing their historical foothold in manufacturing, and simultaneously, they're lagging behind in the educational credentials required to pivot.
Man. So they got essentially trapped between an industrial economy that no longer exists and a knowledge economy they just don't have the credentials to enter.
Right. And this specific combination fuels a really deep, measurable sentiment of economic disenfranchisement.
Which means this feeling of displacement isn't just imagined, right?
Huh.
It's grounded in a tangible loss of livelihood and social standing.
Absolutely.
But the source material makes a hard pivot here.
Yeah.
It makes it really clear that this isn't just a working class phenomenon.
No, not at all.
White-collar men are experiencing their own version of the floor disappearing. But it's happening in completely different industries and for completely different reasons.
Yeah, the institutional data from 2014 through the mid-2020s reveals a significant drop in representation for straight white men in highly influential white-collar sectors.
What sectors are we talking about specifically?
The text specifically singles out media, academia, medicine, and law.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And these are not just high-paying jobs. These are the culture-making and gatekeeping institutions of society.
Which is huge because when the demographics of the gatekeepers change, the overarching narrative of the culture changes with it.
Exactly.
And the source attributes this specific shift directly to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI policies.
Yes, it focuses heavily on the impact of DEI.
There is even a reference in the source to an op-ed talking about a, quote, lost generation of white millennial men in these fields.
Right. Men who grew up being told they would have a very specific linear career trajectory.
And then they suddenly found the rules of institutional advancement fundamentally altered halfway through their careers.
Exactly. And this is where the sociological analysis hits the absolute core of our current cultural polarization.
Because the way these policies are interpreted is just completely split.
Totally split. The source outlines two starkly opposing frameworks for understanding these institutional shifts. We should look at both neutrally to understand the friction.
Yeah, let's break them down. According to the text, what is the conservative view?
So the conservative view, which the text notes is driven by various advocacy groups and commentators, argues that these DEI hiring practices amount to overt discrimination.
Right.
They view institutional advancement as a zero-sum game, essentially. So in that framework, policies designed to elevate minority groups are actively and unfairly penalizing white men who are currently in the workforce.
Okay, that makes sense as one perspective. And then the text outlines the progressive and sociological framework, which essentially looks at the exact same data, but views it through a historical lens rather than a present tense lens.
Right, exactly. In the progressive narrative, historical advantages are simply being corrected.
How does the text explain that sociological argument?
The argument presented in the material is that true equality requires dismantling built-in preferences that have existed for centuries.
So they don't see it as a zero-sum penalty.
No. From this viewpoint, the policies aren't designed to target or punish straight white men. Rather, they are designed to level a playing field that has been artificially tilted in their favor since the inception of these institutions.
Okay, wait, hold on. I'm having trouble squaring this circle based on the data we started with.
What do you mean?
Well, we established at the very beginning of this deep dive that straight white men still hold the absolute majority of political offices and corporate boardrooms.
They do, yes.
So if they still hold the keys, and they still have the numerical majority in executive power, how is it possible they are simultaneously experiencing a lost generation and losing cultural ground?
It sounds contradictory.
Yeah, that math isn't mathing for me.
Yeah.
Like, how can both of those realities exist in the exact same society?
Oh, it comes down to the crucial difference between absolute power and the trajectory of cultural influence.
Okay, break that down for me.
Let's look at the mechanics of perception. Imagine you have historically held, say, 90% of the seats in a boardroom, or 90% of the influence in a cultural institution.
Okay, I'm with you.
Over a decade, that number drops to 70%. You still hold an overwhelming absolute majority. You still mathematically control the room,
Right.
but your trajectory is a steep downward curve. You have lost 20% of your historical influence, and the sheer velocity of that change feels incredibly destabilizing.
Oh, I see. So the perception of social standing isn't based on the fact that you still have 70% of the pie. It is entirely based on the feeling of that 20% slipping through your fingers.
Exactly. The human brain processes loss much more acutely than it processes current stability.
Wow, yeah.
The source notes that this downward trajectory and influence is driven by expanding social equality and the risks of minority, female, and LGBTQ+ voices in pop culture, politics, and leadership.
So it's a redistribution of voice.
Yes. And for a demographic accustomed to holding nearly complete cultural hegemony, this redistribution feels like a direct personal displacement.
Even if the raw statistics say they are still technically winning.
Precisely. The lived experience is one of rapid, disorienting loss.
And when you combine that profound feeling of losing your cultural foothold with the economic reality of losing your traditional job, you don't just get political frustration.
No, it goes much deeper than that.
You get a measurable, devastating public health crisis. The transition in the text from the economic data to the actual human fallout of this displacement is genuinely sobering.
It really is, because when a group experiences this multi-layered crisis, the text highlights two extreme reactions.
Right. One is deeply internalized and the other is highly externalized.
Let's look at the internalized reaction first, because it exposes a profound mental health crisis.
Yeah. The data provided regarding firearm suicides is just staggering. It really highlights how deeply this loss of societal standing impacts the individual psyche.
The numbers are incredibly tough to read.
The text states that white males account for the highest rates of gun suicide of any demographic in the United States.
Yeah.
And to put the sheer scale of that into perspective for you, suicides account for a massive 80% of all gun-related deaths among white Americans.
80%.
80%. That is a community turning its despair violently inward.
It's tragic.
And the detail that really highlights the generational whiplash we've been discussing is that older white males, specifically those ages 70 and above, face the absolute highest rates of all.
Right. And sociologically, this points to a severe crisis of purpose and just profound isolation.
Because they've seen the most change.
Exactly. Think about it. These older men lived through the era of peak 1950s and 60s hegemony. They experienced the era where the cultural and economic architecture was most heavily tilted in their favor.
So they remember what the peak looked like.
Yes. To reach the end of one's life and feel that the world you understood, the status you held, and the cultural norms you relied on have all been fundamentally dismantled.
It creates a complete void.
Sociologists call it a state of normlessness, and the lethality of the method they are choosing reflects the finality of their despair.
Wow.
It is a really tragic manifestation of struggling to navigate a society that just no longer recognizes their historical role.
It's just incredibly difficult to read those numbers and not feel the weight of that internal collapse. It's just devastating.
It is.
But the source material also points out that not everyone turns that disorientation inward. There is a highly visible, highly vocal external reaction happening simultaneously, right?
Yes, very much so.
Because when a demographic's foundational narrative is challenged, a certain subset is always going to fight back against the shifting architecture.
Right, and the text examines this external reaction specifically through the radicalization of right-wing conservative Christian white nationalists.
How does the text connect the dots there?
Well, it highlights how the complex macroeconomic and demographic realities we've been discussing, the census math, the supply chains, those are often rejected by these groups in favor of something simpler.
Like conspiracy theories.
Exactly. Specifically, the panic surrounding the Great Replacement theory.
It's fascinating how the source frames this from a sociological perspective.
Yeah.
It essentially argues that this conspiracy mongering isn't just random political extremism.
No, it sees it as a function.
Right, it's a direct, panicked, psychological defense mechanism. The text actually uses some very sharp language here, and I want to quote it neutrally just to share what the sociologist is arguing.
Go for it.
It asserts that these groups are leaning into these conspiracies because they are quoting the text directly in complete panic mode because the privileged feel oppressed when equality arrives.
And that is a really crucial sociological lens to understand whether you agree with the phrasing or not.
Right.
The argument there is that when a group is accustomed to unearned privilege, the arrival of a level playing field feels indistinguishable from active oppression.
So the radicalization serves as a coping mechanism.
Exactly. Psychologically, it is much easier to explain your loss of status by blaming a coordinated, shadowy external force like a great replacement conspiracy than it is to accept these complex, impersonal realities.
Like changing census demographics and evolving global supply chains.
Right, or shifting educational requirements. The conspiracy theory provides a villain, and having a villain to fight is much more comforting than accepting that the world simply moved on without you.
Wow. So bringing all these threads together for you, the listener, we started by looking at a paradox that really defines our current cultural moment.
The paradox of power versus perception.
Yes, straight white men holding the statistical majority of institutional power, yet feeling a deep existential sense of displacement.
Right.
And through these sources, we can see that this feeling isn't just manufactured outrage. It is a complex knot tied together by very real, undeniable demographic shifts.
Marching steadily toward that majority-minority nation in 2045.
Exactly. It's tied to the harsh economic reality of a working class losing its manufacturing anchor and its educational foothold.
And it's tied to a white-collar world where the culture-making institutions are fundamentally altering the rules of advancement to correct historical imbalances. And understanding the mechanics behind this friction is so essential for you, the listener, because these dynamics dictate the reality you live in every single day.
It really is the water we're swimming in.
It is. Regardless of your own background or your political leanings, this specific demographic anxiety is actively reshaping the American landscape.
Right.
It is the invisible engine driving our political polarization, dictating the media narratives we consume, and as that tragic data on self-harm shows, it is profoundly impacting public health.
You simply cannot decode the actions of modern political and cultural movements without understanding the deep fear of displacement driving them. It touches absolutely everything.
It does.
But as we wrap up this analysis today, there's a question hanging in the air that the source material doesn't quite answer, and it's something I want to leave you with to mull over.
Okay, what's the question?
Well, all of the data, all of the tragedy, and all of the friction we discussed today focuses on men who grew up with these historical advantages reacting to the loss of them.
Right. The trauma is entirely based on the memory of hegemony.
Exactly. But what about the next generation? If the U.S. truly becomes a majority-minority nation by 2045, how will boys who are growing up in a diverse society today define their own identity?
That's a great point.
How will they carve out their societal role, having never actually known the historical dominance and the resulting friction that defined their fathers' and grandfathers' generations?
They won't have that same baseline.
No, they won't. It really makes you wonder what kind of cultural architecture they are going to build from scratch.